Alrighty, I think that we will go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and greetings from the rainy today Washington, greater Washington, D.C. area. And thank you for joining a new entry in APS's Government Research Funding and Policy webinar series. Today, I'm very happy to introduce an event titled Meet the Program Officers, NSF Perception, Action, and Cognition. My name is Andy DeSoto. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Association for Psychological Science. And if you aren't familiar with APS, we are an international organization of about 30,000 individuals who are dedicated to advancing research psychology for the benefit of science and society. We hope you're thinking about attending the APS virtual convention. Our early bird registration ends April 15th. So visit psychologicalscience.org to learn more about that. But for today, we're very excited to introduce a special presentation from the program officials of the National Science Foundation's Perception, Action, and Cognition program. As you probably know, NSF is one of the key funders of psychological science, and this Perception, Action, and Cognition program is especially important for our field. Our speakers today are NSF Program Director, Dr. Betty Tuller, who's an APS Fellow, and Dr. Michael Hout, also an NSF Program Director and Associate Professor in Psychology at New Mexico State University. Betty and Mike have a wonderful overview of NSF funding planned, which will really dive into some of the nitty-gritty of navigating key sources of support for psychological scientists. Before we get started, just a few logistical details to go over. Today's webinar will be 60 minutes, and there will be opportunity for an extended casual question and answer session following the webinar. So you know, participants' cameras and mics will be off for this session, so no worries about that. If you do have a question for the panelists, either during their talks or following the session, we encourage you to make use of the question and answer box that's at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. And like I mentioned, Mike and Betty, they are able to stay past the hour to answer any extended questions if they come up. So if you're free, please do stay on. This is a really great opportunity to have your questions answered. This event will be recorded, a video, the slides, and a write-up will be made available for you after the presentation and posted on APS's website. With that, I think I will hand it over to Betty and Mike for their presentation. Betty and Mike, thank you so much for joining us today, and I can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I hope we get to see everybody next year in person, but thank you to the APS for arranging this. We have 64 people online, so at least it's going out to someone. The hardest thing for me is not doing this by video, it's doing this sitting down. I'm not sure I can actually give a talk sitting down, but here we go. There's lots of funding at the National Science Foundation that is appropriate for our sciences. If we go to the next slide, I'll just give you a little bit of a structure for what I'm going to talk about today. These web links are going to be posted, so don't worry about writing them down. First thing I'm going to talk about, and I'll spend a lot of time on it, is how to find the right program at NSF. That's probably the most important thing to know. There are many different scientific programs at NSF. There's a lot of overlap among them. There are some differences that are really important in what their particular foci are. So how to find the right program is really the most important part. Then I'll spend some time on what makes a strong grant proposal, what happens to this beautiful piece of work once you actually hit submit and it goes into NSF. We'll have some questions and discussion, and then we are going to give you an opportunity to do a one-on-one with Mike and myself. Next, please. Next slide.
Betty, you were cutting out just a little bit. I don't know if you're on a VPN or anything now.
I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not. Okay, so the first questions to ask yourself is, the first one is this work that I'm proposing appropriate for NSF or is it appropriate for NIH? And if it's appropriate for NSF, where should I put it? What directorate, and then what program within the directorate should I submit to? Next slide, please. There are some real basic differences between NSF and NIH. NSF funds basic research. It could have very close applications to biomedical science, but the particular focus cannot be primarily biomedical. There are some small exceptions to that. For example, in engineering, there's a program called Disabilities and Age-Related Engineering, and that is primarily looking at engineering or technical applications to help in certain biomedical situations. For most of us, we're not doing that in the psychological sciences. If your work is appropriate and has implications and impact to something biomedical, that's fine. But if your basic question is to understand a particular atypical disorder, so autism, for example, or reading disorders or aphasia, then it's really for NIH, not for NSF. NSF and NIH also run things quite differently. At NIH, you can go online, you can find who is going to be on the study section that you're going to. And of course, usually then you would reference those people in your proposal. At NSF, you can't do that. All of the reviewers, all of the panelists, these are all confidential. Even when you get your feedback, you'll get the verbatim reviews, but they will be de-identified. There will be anonymous reviews with no names attached. At NIH, the panels also have a standard time where each panel member stays for a certain number of years. At NSF, panel membership changes frequently. Some panels might have a standing panel for 3 or 4 years. Other panels, it changes each time, each cycle, depending on the content area of the reviews of the proposals that are going to be reviewed. We also use ad hoc reviewers a lot, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. In the Computer and Information Science Directorate, they use almost all panelist reviewers. In social, behavioral, and economic sciences, we really use a lot of ad hoc or mail-in reviewers. You have an opportunity when you put in a grant proposal to suggest reviewers. It's an opportunity lost if you don't fill in that form and give us some suggestions. If nothing else, it tells us the appropriate space where we should be finding reviewers for your particular proposal. Another difference between NSF and NIH is that for us, each submission is considered independent. There's no 3 strikes and you're out rule or 2 strikes and you're out rule. Of course, if you put it in 3 or 4 times and it's getting knocked back and not even close each time, you might want to rethink. But the rethink is because of prudence and not because of any rules on the NSF side. The other difference between NSF and NIH, and what makes being a program director at NSF fun, is that all of the panelist reviews and the external reviews are advisory to the program officers. We don't have a strict ranking or number system. Right? So we take this expertise and then we incorporate it into our considerations, which could also include things like program balance, geographic balance, minority PIs, the broader impacts, which we'll get to. We also don't have a uniform rating system across all of the National Science Foundation. Every panel is going to be using a different rating scale. It's constantly shifting. So you need to read the statement that you get from your program director telling you how to interpret your reviews. We're also very interactive within NSF. We are not in silos. We co-review and we co-fund within NSF very, very often, a little bit less often with other agencies because of the red tape, but it still happens quite a bit. Next slide. So if you decide that your proposal really is not primarily biomedical, it really is basic research, how do you know where you should submit it, which directorate and which program? So at NSF, the directorates are kind of like colleges within universities. And the programs are more akin to departments. They're under the directorates. So these are the directorates at NSF. The ones that are primarily of most interest to our community are social, behavioral, and economic sciences, of course, but also there are programs that are directly relevant in engineering, computer and information science and engineering, geosciences, because in polar programs, there's a lot of work on social, behavioral aspects of these remote communities. The Office of Integrative Activities, education and human resources, and the international science and engineering programs. So don't restrict yourself just to SBE. Next slide, please. So how do you find the right program? I'm going to use SBE as the example, since it's probably the most common directorate for people here. If you go to the NSF website, which is really not a very good website, it's in the process of being updated, which means it will only be 10 years out of date instead of 20. So this is nsf.gov, which is the main NSF page. And then under funding, I went to social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And then there's a link, as you can see in the column on the left, that says programs. That lists a huge array of programs, not only those within social, behavioral, and economic sciences, but also the ones where we are partnering with other programs within the foundation, within NSF. Within SBE, there are two divisions. One is behavioral and cognitive sciences, and the other is social, economic, and I forgot what the other is. Oh, social and economic sciences, SES. They're not good names because some of the programs in SES are directly relevant to this community. For example, decision, risk, and management sciences. So decision-making research actually falls in large part under a different division than the rest of the cognitive sciences. Next slide, please. Okay. So once you've narrowed down, and let's say you think you fall within developmental science, right? Go to their program webpage. There's a lot of important information there. The first is, who is the program director, right? How do you contact them? How do you apply? Under program guidelines, here it says apply to PD 08-1698 as follows. PD means program description. It's not a separate solicitation. Many of us just follow the general proposal submission procedures in the NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. It's hyperlinked on all of these web pages in the line under the apply to line. It's a sort of generic way of submitting a proposal. On the other hand, some programs will have a separate solicitation. Their webpage is where they'll tell you that, and there's always a link to it. Right? Going further down, the due dates. When do you apply? Is there only one cycle for application each year, or are there two cycles? Is it a target date, or is it a deadline? The difference is target date means you have a little wiggle room. Let's say the target date is January 15th, and you really need another day or two. You can contact the program director and ask for a little bit more time. If it's a deadline, we can't give you that time. It's a hard and fast deadline, and that deadline is 5 p.m. your local time. So that's an important thing to know as well. And for many of you listening, you will have put in proposals to NSF several times already, and you think you already know the rules. Well, think again. We update these web pages often, the rules change often, the requirements change often, and you don't really want a proposal that you've worked very hard on to be returned to you for really a silly reason that you wouldn't have had if you had simply read the web page. Next slide, please. Okay, so scrolling down on that web page, there's a synopsis about each program, right? Read it, see if your research seems to be relevant to this particular program. And down at the bottom, which will really help, is this link that says what has been funded, recent awards made through this program with abstracts. That's one of the best ways to find out if your work falls within the purview of a particular program. If you click it, next page, please, you'll come to a page that tells you all of the awards that each program has made recently. This again is for developmental science, right? The blue titles are the titles of the awards, and they are hyperlinked. So if you click on them, you'll wind up getting to the abstract, which has a lot of information, and we'll go there in a moment. One thing to note is that these are only awards, not proposals. Proposals are confidential, so we don't have public access for proposals unless, of course, they get funded. If they get funded, there's public access to a bunch of information about them, as well as the abstracts, but not the body, not the whole proposal itself. If you want to see a proposal, you need to either contact the PI and ask them for a copy, or go through the Freedom of Information Act, which takes a long time. So if you click on one of these titles, next slide, please. I clicked on one of them, and you wind up at this description, right? It has the name of the program manager, that is the program officer who is managing this particular award, the date it started, the date it ends, so it tells you how long it's for. The mode of our awards is absolutely 3 years, but sometimes they're shorter and sometimes they're a bit longer. The amount awarded, which only makes sense in the context of the duration, right? Who the principal investigators are, the university, and what becomes really important are the NSF programs, what's called the program element code 2 lines after that, right? The program, the NSF programs means who gave money to this. Often there'll be more than one program there. And that's because we, as I said, we often work together and we often co-fund proposals if they appeal to and fall within the mission for more than one program. To you as a potential principal investigator to investigate not only developmental sciences, but the other programs where you also might fit. And this is one hint to what those programs might be. The program element code is another way to search that we'll find in a minute, but remember that, not that name, program element code. Next slide, please. Okay, so another way to get to the same page is to go to the nsf.gov, which is the main NSF webpage. Under awards, go to search awards. Next, please. You could do a simple search, which is just, putting keywords into this open bar, or you can do an advanced search. Let's do an advanced search. Next, please. Let's say you know people who do similar work. You can search for their name and see who funded them, right? You could also go to the element code, which is that program element code we just saw on the abstract. You can search for the element code if you don't happen to know it by clicking on that little magnifying glass next to the search bar. You could search by keyword. In this case, we're going to search visual attention. You can search active awards and or expired awards. Next, please. And if you do that, you get to the same kind of a listing that you got to by clicking on awards recently funded by a particular program. Okay. Again, each of these blue titles are clickable. Next. And again, you get to the award abstract. In this case, it was visual attention in an invertebrate predator. I don't know why. You can see that it was $333,334, but it had an amendment. This is an amendment. It means you have to go back and do another search to find out really how much was paid by each of these people. I mean, how much was paid for each year, okay? Next, please. So let's say you've gone through all of this, and this is quite time consuming. It's really doing your research to find the right place for your work. That's half the battle. Once you think you've identified the right program or maybe a set of programs, you should contact the program directors to see if you're correct. First, do it by email. Please do not cold call. If you just call me and I pick it up, you're not going to get 100% of my attention. And you're going to want 100% of my attention, right? Introduce yourself via email. What's your training, your expertise? What level of appointment do you have, right? That makes a difference. If you're a postdoc, you may or may not be able to put in as a principal investigator. If you're a PhD student, doctoral dissertation improvement grants and others don't, so you would not be eligible to submit. So let us know, give us that kind of information. The other thing you should do is summarize your proposed research in no more than 1.5 pages. What's your research question? What's your theoretical background or framing for the research question? What methods are you going to use to try to answer it? And why should we care, right? What is going to be the impact of this kind of research? Email all of the potentially relevant program directors in a single email with everyone copied. As I said, NSF is not really siloed. It's very small. There are about 1,500 people in the whole building when we're actually in the building. What I would do if I got an email like this, and I thought, oh, that's not really for my program, but it looks relevant for cognitive neuroscience, I would send it along to the Cogneuro program director to say, are you interested? You know, what should I tell this PI? The problem is if the Cogneuro person has already, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. There was a line, someone missed what you said about if someone was a PhD student, and I missed that as well because I was answering another question in the chat.
Sure. If you're a PhD student, some programs have what are called doctoral dissertation improvement grants. Some programs don't. So for PAC, for Perception, Action, Cognition, we think doctoral students should be in a mentorship relationship with their major advisor. So we fund a lot of grad students, but in the context of a regular research proposal put in by a faculty member. Some other programs, for example, linguistics, they tend to be programs where there's field research, where the student is doing quite a bit more independently. They have these doctoral dissertation research improvement grants. They're called DDRIGs. We might also then send you to the graduate research fellowship program, right? So if we know what level if we know where you are in your studies, right? We know what programs we should tell you to go look at. So that's important to know. Okay, I mean, this is terrible. I can't see anyone nodding their head to say yes, okay. Next slide. When you're looking for the right program, because there's going to be some time, right? If you don't hear from us within, I would say, a week to 10 days, email again, because once your email falls below that line on your email program, it's really hard to reconstruct it sometimes. So just ask again. But while you're looking for the right program, there are some things you can do to further the progress of your grant proposal. One is to ask other people for copies of their successful proposals. If you have friends or mentors, especially people with whom you have a conflict of interest, so you know that they can't actually be reviewers for your proposal, right? Like your mentors, your previous graduate advisors, people who you have perhaps published with or are working with, ask them for copies of their proposals, right? Volunteer to be an ad hoc reviewer. That's really important because then you get to read a bunch of proposals and you can see what works and what doesn't. You're really telling a story in your proposal. And if you're reading a proposal, you'll know if this is reading well or not. Accept our requests to review proposals as an ad hoc or mail-in reviewer. Again, things change often, so don't assume you know. Look at the grant proposal guide. Also line up people who are willing to comment on your proposal drafts. They might be the same people who you're asking for comments of for copies of their proposals. You really want your mentors and your colleagues to rip apart your draft. You don't want the panel, the review panel, to be in the position of doing that. By the time it gets to the panel, you want it to be a lot better than that. Also, sign up for NSF alerts or emails from the programs that are relevant for your work. and give yourself plenty of time. It always takes at least twice as long as you think. Next. So I just have this, I think, to show people that how to get NSF updates by email that I talked about. So under funding, again, on the nsf.gov website, click on find funding, right? So just click on that, next. And there's a little link where you can get funding information by email, right? Or RSS feed, which I don't think anybody ever does anymore. And you can do an advanced funding search where you can get the email for particular programs, particular kinds of work, and so on, or only from some directorates, for example. You don't have to get a lot of stuff from NSF all the time, right? Some programs will also have a sign up on their webpage, but as I said, the NSF, the whole web is being updated, and whether or not they're going to let us do that again, I'm not so sure. Next.
Penny, there's one that might be an easy thing to address live if you don't mind.
Sure.
Someone's asking, if someone is soon to be a postdoc, are there postdoctoral fellowships where the postdoc can re-establish a relationship with his or her doctoral institution?
There is nothing explicitly for that, but there's nothing that I know of that explicitly forbids it in any postdoctoral solicitations. We don't have a lot for out of the context of a regular research grant. Some universities allow postdocs to be principal investigators, some do not, right? But there's nothing that says you cannot establish a relationship with your previous institution or mentor. On the other hand, one of the points of postdoctoral funding is to get you established as an independent researcher. So unless there's a really compelling reason for linking back with your graduate mentors, then it's unlikely to do very well. Okay, so let's say you have now found the right program for your proposal. What you really need to do is print and read. I don't like to advocate killing trees, but for the program that you're going to be putting in the proposal to, you need to print out either their program description, print out their solicitation if they have one. And if not, look at the proposal and award policies and procedures guide and print out the relevant sections for putting in a proposal. And then as you go through it, you're going to like stick that up on the wall next to your laptop or your monitor, and you're going to be checking things off, because you don't want a silly reason to be the reason why your proposal gets returned without review. That's a really bad thing to happen. Next slide. Okay, so you found the right program. You think you know how to put in a proposal. What do you do next? Long before the due date, you need to either email or visit your sponsored research office. I found it's really, everything works much better if you just walk down to the sponsored research office when the university's open again, preferably with a plate of cookies, because then they remember you. Get an ID for logging in to either Fastlane or research.gov, depending on what your sponsored research office uses to submit proposals. NSF is in the process of switching from Fastlane to research.gov, right? Some functionality of Fastlane is still not there in research.gov. So I'm not even sure if that you could put in collaborative proposals yet in research.gov. It might have just changed, but your sponsored research office will know. You can also submit through grants.gov, although to be honest, I have no idea why anyone would want to do that. It's much, yeah.
One of the questions we had earlier was whether or not there is a place to indicate other programs for co-review at the time of submission. I think that's one of the things that varies depending on whether you submit from Fastlane or research.gov. Is that the case?
Yeah. Yes, Fastline is very easy. When it asks you what program is most relevant, there's a drop-down box. The first one you click is going to be the managing program. The other ones that you click, because you can click more than one, are going to be alerted that you would like to be co-reviewed by those programs. It's a request, right? So it's not binding. It alerts the program directors to look at it and say, yes, this is relevant to my program also, or to say, no, this is really on the fringe. It's not going to do well in my program. Okay. In research.gov, it's a little bit more confusing. That functionality is there, but only if you choose the proposal, the PAPG, the proposal, and I forget what it stands for that we just had, the procedures guide. If you choose that as the document that you are submitting in response to, then it will give you an option for other units of consideration, which is the government speak for co-review, right? If you choose a particular program description, then it doesn't give you that option. So just a good rule of thumb is if you're going to go through research.gov, always choose the proposal and procedures guide, unless there's a specific solicitation. If it's only a program description, choose that general guide, and then it will allow you to request co-review.
And it's not a bad idea to just contact the program officers ahead of time to give them a heads up in case something doesn't make it through the system. It's never a bad idea to just let us know what your intentions are.
Yes, I mean, that's a good point, Mike, because we co-review a lot for proposals that didn't request it, right? As we go through, we think, this is also relevant to developmental science. Let's see if they'll review it also. It's not double jeopardy. Very often things that do sort of well, I mean, maybe not the very top, but still solid in 2 programs will get funded before something that's even a little bit higher in only 1 program, because then we split the costs and the money goes further. There's also a real push to help those areas that are not traditional, but fall within the boundaries across programs. So the first thing that you're going to do is start on the required documents, right? Some of these required documents, like the budget, aren't just up to you. They need approval from your chair, from your sponsored research office, and so on. So they're going to take time. Create that draft first, just to make sure all the necessary costs are included. That's also important because, after all, the budget and the science should not be independent, right? If you look at the award search, remember you could see how much money each proposal got. You can kind of get a range for how much that program gives. If your budget for the science you would like to propose is 3 times the size of what the average award size is, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, and you might want to restrict the science to something more manageable so that the budget will be a bit smaller. You don't want to do that too much, because it's not the case that we fund the smallest budgets first or anything like that. We try and fund the best science, but each program has really a budget that hasn't changed in the last 10 years, probably longer, right? And of course, budgets are going up all the time. So make sure the budget is reasonable for the program. There are also internal timelines for approvals. Plan for everything taking longer, the person who has to go through it being out of the office, 90 other people putting in a proposal for the same deadline, half of them to NSF, half to NIH, right? So make sure the internal timeline is not only held to, but try and be early. And again, be nice to your sponsored research officer, because if he or she has 10 of them to put through, it always helps if they know you and like you. Next slide. So doing the budget early helps define the scope of the work. Follow the PAPG, proposal and procedures, whatever guide. Look at the different budget categories and what they allow. It's not always self-evident. For example, the part that says participant support costs is not for paying human subjects, right? So you really need to read what the budget categories are and what's allowed. Check the range of the award sizes for the program. So for example, in PAC, our award size is anything from, small being workshops up to maybe 700 to 750,000 over 3 years, including indirect costs, right? Sometimes it's more if we can get buy-in from another program. Often it's less. That's another difference between NSF and NIH that I didn't mention, is when NSF talks about money, it will always be total costs, direct costs plus indirect costs. When NIH talks about money, they're only talking about direct costs. Okay. So personnel costs will add up very quickly because it's not just salary, it's fringes and indirect costs, right? So again, work with your sponsored research office to know what's allowable, what's required. So universities are now requiring tuition often where they did not before. And to know what the final total is going to be once the indirect costs are calculated, see if that fits within generally what the program you're interested in funds. And if it doesn't, you might have to rethink the science. Okay. Next slide.
Betty, sorry to cut in real quick.
Yeah.
I'm answering some questions in the chat, and apologies everyone. There's a lot of acronyms that we use. If you see me writing PD, it means program director, or PO for program officer. They're used interchangeably. I just mean people like me and Betty who are running programs and that can communicate with you about your work.
Correct. Most people in SPE use program officer. I like program director better. It just sounds slightly more scientific. So at NSF, when you're writing the guts of your proposal, it will be reviewed on two major issues. One is intellectual merit and the other is broader impacts. Intellectual merit, the potential to advance knowledge. This is the stuff that everybody understands, right? This is the kind of thing that we do as scientists. Will the proposed activity advance basic science? Will it help only within its own field? Will it help cross fields? Our basics. The other question is the project likely to be successful? So is the team qualified? Does the PI have the necessary experience in the methodologies that are proposed? If not, do they give you a way of getting that methodology expertise, right? Is there sufficient access to resources? If it's an experiment that requires MRI, do they have access to MRI? Right? To what extent does the activity explore creative and original concepts? The word transformational is often thrown around. How well conceived and organized is the science that's proposed? We sort of just intuitively understand intellectual merit as scientists. Next page. Harder is to understand society. And NSF takes the broader impacts very, very seriously. This link here is to a new Dear Colleague letter that just came out, trying to explain broader impacts to the SBE community, to the social, behavioral, and economic science community. We tend to think small when it comes to broader impacts, we being the scientific community. What NSF is hoping is to goad all the scientists into thinking bigger about how their work can benefit the broader society in the US and elsewhere, right? That being said, throwaway lines don't work, right? When I was putting in my first research grants, especially to NIH, I would be able to say things like, I hope this work will at some point help influence the procedures that speech pathologists use for speech impairment after stroke. And that was good enough. That's not good enough, right? You need to demonstrate the impact with specificity. Another kind of broader impact is, can you disseminate the results broadly? And that means publicly accessible, written in a way that the general public can understand in order to enhance the scientific and technological understanding, but also to enhance people's awareness, the general public's awareness about the importance of our sciences. Will you be making data or code publicly available when appropriate? Sometimes it's not appropriate. Is the work going to enhance the infrastructure for research and education, right? Will you be creating shared facilities, shared instrumentation, networks for discussion, partnerships, in particular partnerships with minority serving institutions, HBCUs, community colleges, right? Things that will enhance the workforce of the future within broad underrepresented groups. A lot of the proposals we see say, we're going to have 2 grad students and we will recruit students from underrepresented groups, period. How, right? Where are you going to get them? Are you linked into anything like the McNair Scholars Program? Do you have a program at university for recruiting and supporting while they're there students from underrepresented groups and so on? It has to be specific. Another broader impact is to promote teaching, training, and learning, right? So creating new programs, creating new curricula, and so on. These are all parts of broader impact. Summer workshops, either at the university level or maybe at the high school level. We have a very successful broader impact called Girls with Nerve, and it's middle school students, primarily middle school women who come for a month to learn how robotics can be scientific studies. So you have to be really specific, but try and think bigger rather than we're going to train 2 graduate students. That's de minimis. Next, please. Okay, so what makes a proposal competitive? Original and timely ideas, sound rationale. Really important to have a strong theoretical basis with the relevant literature review. Really pretty well-organized set of experiments with no theoretical framework telling not only how they fit together, but why they're important is not going to fly. Very important to consider alternative explanations, right? Not just come in from one approach and try and test it. Because if you don't consider alternative explanations, the bottom line results are not going to have much impact. Like scientifically as well as broader impact, a succinct, focused, and detailed project plan. So people are going to want to know that what you're planning to do, you are able to do. You have the expertise to do, you've considered the number of subjects, you've considered the control experiments, the control situations, and so on. The broader impact's developed, not just listed. If you have experience in the essential methodology that you're proposing, then you don't necessarily need pilot data, we don't require it. But if you're proposing something that you've not published in before, the reviewers want to know that you're able to do it, right? In that case, pilot data becomes more important. Pilot data are also important if you're proposing something that really is like out there, that people don't think is going to come out the way you think, right? If your pilot data support that hypothesis, then it's in a stronger situation. That don't actually support the hypothesis being put forward. That doesn't help your case. Now, it's not that your hypothesis is necessarily wrong. It might just be a small sample, right? But be aware that if you can read your pilot data in a way that's not supporting the hypothesis you're putting forward, the proposal is not likely to do very well unless you have a rationale for why that might have been the case. A proposal is also competitive if the timeline and the budget are realistic. If you put in every experiment you can think of and then a timeline of 2 years, it doesn't bode well. It's unlikely you're going to be able to get everything done on time and also in budget. And then really the most important is if the experiments work, if they come out the way you think they're going to come out, will anyone care? Why should we care? What is going to be the impact of these results? Next, please.
Betty, so I have two questions I'd like to answer live that would be good for right now. They're related. And they have to do with making proposals competitive when they're coming from basically non-R1 institutions. So the first question is, how can PIs who are early career faculty from R2 institutions, such as EPSCoR states, increase their chances of their research proposals being funded? And the second question that's very much related, I work at a primarily undergraduate research institution in a rural area. Would my institution be competitive with top tier R1 research universities? So if you could say something about the diversity of funding and competition, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is potentially competitive. Remember I said before that the reviews and the panels are advisory to the program director. One of the things that we take into account is getting taxpayer money to places that are not one. They pay taxes too, and they play an outsized role in educating the future scientists and workforce. I think that it's not that we don't expect as high quality, but we don't expect as much by way of facilities, for example. Right? You might have more in a proposal from a non-R1 institution about education, workforce development, scientific literacy development, and so on, right? So the impact at this university becomes more important than it is at an R1 institution, right? We also have, there's a solicitation out for especially research proposals coming from MSIs, right, from minority serving institutions, because, you know, this is the future, right? We do expect high scientific good if we're giving money to educate students from MSIs and R2 institutions in bad scientific method, right? But there are an awful lot of really important science questions that can be answered in these places without an awful lot of high-tech equipment, for example, and really involving the students more in the research. Does that help? Now, for people coming from these institutions, from PIs, NSF has a policy that it doesn't pay more than 2 months of salary from all of your NSF awards combined, except in exceptional cases. And in one of those exceptional cases is a really high teaching load. So if you're coming from a primarily undergraduate institution, you're teaching 3 courses a semester, you can put in for buyout time as well, right? We would also proposal that assesses how you're going to help the institution get a better research education for its students by using your proposal, right? So the impact on the institution and the students becomes really important. I can't see a head nodding, so I'll say next slide.
You're good.
Okay, next slide. Okay. RWR means return without review. This is the worst possible thing that could happen, other than plagiarism, of course. That is, you work really hard, you put in a grant proposal, and it never even gets reviewed, right? It gets returned to you for reasons that could have been avoided. First of all, if it's not responsive to the solicitation or the program announcement, right? So some solicitations, for example, require 2 investigators from 2 distinctly different the budget size. Some programs have a budget size, some don't. If your budget size doesn't fit within the program announcement requirement, then it's going to be returned without review. If it's not compliant, so you use teeny little letters in order to get more information in, reviewers really get pissed off at that. or if it's actually more than 15 pages, or if the letters of support or the letters of collaboration don't use the appropriate format but have too much information in it than what's allowed, it could be returned without review, right? If a solicitation asks for different documents than usual and you don't include them, return without review. Or if it's submitted after 5 p.m. local time, if it's a deadline, not if it's a target date, it can be returned without review. And lastly, if you submit it to the wrong program and for some reason we just can't that review. Next slide. Now, your institution submits the proposal, not you, right? We talked about research.gov versus FastLane. Research.gov, although it still has some lack of functionality, it does compliance checks for a lot of those things that you could get returned without review for. It checks for fonts, for margins, for line spacing. It passes the information among the forms so you don't have to type it in 12 times. It gives you real-time compliance feedback. It really just is better at making sure that return without review is not an option, okay? Next slide. But the final step, whether you use research.gov or you use FastLane, you think you have uploaded everything, great. Now what you do the proposal from NSF and you check it. You can't rely on what you uploaded. You have to read what NSF thinks you actually submitted. Sometimes there will be a format change and your 15 pages, you know, that has like 3 characters missing and it's perfectly within the 15-page limit. Sometimes when it gets uploaded, it might change the borders and all of a sudden you have 15.5 pages and you could be returned without review. Okay, so read what NSF thinks you submitted, not what you think you submitted. We've had situations where people have put in a proposal that was previously reviewed and by mistake submitted the old proposal again, right? So the last checkpoint is pretend you're NSF, download what you've submitted and look at it carefully. Next slide. Okay, so what happens once your SRO submits the proposal? It can be reviewed either by ad hoc reviewers, a panel reviewers, a combination of them, or only internal review if it's quite small in budget. We make our analysis, we make our recommendations to our division director, that's DD. The division director usually agrees with us, and then it either gets awarded or declined. We try and keep the timeline, excuse me, from the time you submitted to the time you get an answer, whether it's going to be awarded or declined, to no more than 6 months. Next slide, please. What you get, whether you get an award or declined, is you get the verbatim anonymized reviews with their ratings. Each review is supposed to address both intellectual merits and broader impacts. If it went text statement, it's changing its name, but it basically tells you information that helps you interpret your reviews and your ratings. So it'll tell you how many proposals there were, how many wound up in each category. So you'll know if you're in the second category and you didn't get funded, the context statement will still tell you if you're in the top 20% or the top 80% and so on. Often there'll also be a PO comment, a program officer comment, and that's a comment directly from us to the investigator. Often there's more information about how to interpret the reviews and an invitation to contact us if you want to talk about the reviews. Next slide. So even if we recommend the proposal for award, read the reviews in the panel summary. There are often very constructive suggestions reviewers are. We will usually ask you to respond to the reviews and sometimes even to change procedures before actually awarding this. If we recommend that the proposal is going to be declined, develop a thick skin. You're in the majority. We fund, it's hard to figure out how much we fund, but it's like 80 to 90% get declined. There is no 3 strikes rule. Revising and resubmitting is absolutely a chance to learn. It's not like revise and resubmit for a publication, because there's a little bit of a changing bar, because there's no guarantee you're going to get the same reviewers. We try and have at least one reviewer be the same for across iterations, but it doesn't always work. They don't always say yes. But persistence can pay off. Very often revised proposals do get funded. As I said, the reviews are often exceptionally helpful and constructive. Whether you want to address the reviews directly or just revise the application. If you decide to address the reviews directly, like this condition was added in response to a review of a previous submission or something like that, the gotcha is that you don't get any extra space. It's still a 15-page limit. Okay. If you are declined, then schedule a call with your program director. We usually recommend not to do that for about 2 weeks, because you need time to digest the reviews, to calm down, for it not to feel like a personal affront, and to read the reviews carefully and figure out what needs to be done. Next slide. Common criticisms: insufficient detail, right? They couldn't tell really what you wanted to do. The theory was too fuzzy. The predictions weren't clear, and so on. We couldn't figure out how you wanted to analyze all this huge amount of data you were planning to get. Framework, great experiments, but they're disconnected. They don't really relate to the same issue. Very common criticism is that the results could have alternative explanations that you didn't consider, or you also might not have considered unexpected outcomes. If the idea is really risky, proof of concept or preliminary data are helpful. They also are helpful to establish feasibility for doing the work. But often we see reviews that proposals are overambitious, or on the other hand, too incremental. There's a sweet spot between that. They still have to be important, right? Sometimes we fund things that are very incremental if those increments are important to future work. And again, most important, if the experiments work the way you think they're going to work, who's going to care and why should they care? Next slide. Hello. Thank you. Just wanted to mention, we're almost done with the presentation, but NSF now finally has a policy on harassment, sexual and otherwise. It is not tolerated. Organizations have to report findings of sexual harassment or any other kind of harassment regarding a PI or co-PI or any grant personnel. And if you, as an investigator or as a faculty member, whether or not you have NSF funding, if you think that something is going on at your university and you don't really want to bring it to the attention of the institution, you can always bring it to the attention of NSF. We pass it up to the Inspector General, and then they work with the university for the investigation itself. So it's another line of report where you don't have to directly bring your university to your. Next slide. Okay, common myths. This comes to some of the questions. NSF only funds scholars at elite institutions. Absolutely not true. We really are trying to increase the amount of funding that goes to MSIs, R2 institutions, EPSCoR states, and so on. But I have to tell you, we don't get a lot of applications from EPSCoR states and MSIs or HBCUs, and I really wish we got more. So spread the word. Another myth is that NSF only funds famous academics. I would say that each time we fund quite a few early career investigators far more than the famous academics who are very expensive. We also don't fund only established investigators. I think it's a place where the reviewers and the programs are willing to take chances. There's a myth that we only fund normal or safe science when really a little bit out there. Of course, we don't want to fund only crazy science, but you need a balance between things that you know are going to further the area and are probably going to work, and others that are high risk, but are going to be really important if they work out. Once declined, always declined? Absolutely not. As I said, revising the proposal very often has a beneficial effect. And makes funding decisions, which is much closer to the NIH model with study section and council. It's more sort of a discussion. And if something's coming from an MSI, or if something's coming from an HBCU or an R2 institution or an EPSCoR state, we can often get co-funding for it, which makes it far easier to fund. Next slide. Okay, and the bottom line is keep trying. I did an analysis about the same proportion of male and female investigators as in the professoriate, and they get funded at about the same rate, which is fabulous. We get far more resubmissions by male investigators than by female, right? So keep trying, it's really important. And then ignore this one-on-one with a PD. Mike, do you want to talk about how to set up individual talks with us?
Yeah, we decided that just simply emailing Betty and myself at the same time would be the best way to try and find a time, preferably next week or the week after, to have a one-on-one session with either Betty or I, whoever can meet your schedule. So the best way, will you go to the next slide, please? I think our email addresses are there. So like I said, please do email both of us at the same time. Let us know when your availability is, and one or both of us will get back to you and we'll send you a time for either a phone call or a Zoom chat to talk about your ideas. Some of the questions that I answered, I repeatedly referenced quote one-pagers. If you want to talk to us about specific proposal ideas that you're thinking of sending to PAC, for instance, when you reach out to us to schedule a time to chat, attach your one-pager so that we can have an opportunity to look it over before we chat with you. If you just want to talk about procedures or things you didn't understand from this webinar, that's fine too. Just give us a heads up on what the nature of the conversation is that you'd like to have. So please write down those email addresses and email us both at the same time. Again, these slides are going to be shared after the fact, so you'll have it even if you don't write down the email addresses right now. Betty, there's a couple questions that I thought we could answer live.
Sure. I just want to add one thing.
Oh, here.
One of the reasons for the one-pagers is that Mike and I have very different science backgrounds. Our areas of expertise are different. So if you attach a one-pager, we know which of us is the best one to talk to you.
Yep.
So,
and somebody just put in the question and answer, when you say one-pager, do you mean project summary or overview objectives? There's not a specific format that we look for, but if you're going to prepare an NSF proposal, you're going to have to write a project summary anyway. So if you can write it in the style of a project summary, that can in fact be helpful. If you have something a little bit, off of that format or has a little bit more detail on your methods or whatever, that's okay too. But yes, a project summary style one-pager is an effective way to let us know what you're thinking. Okay, so one question that I can handle that's easy is the next grant deadline in June for all areas. Different programs have different deadlines or target dates. So depending on where you want to submit your proposal, you definitely have to look into the specific deadlines and target dates for the program that you are interested in. Betty, here's one. This is a little bit, I wasn't expecting something like this. So sometimes when I request payment to a subject, if that person is on my college's payroll, so I'm guessing like an undergraduate that might be a student worker or something, our business office then charges my grant for Social Security and such. Are they supposed to be doing that for subject payments? I did request in my grant those charges for summer interns, but not for subjects.
I haven't a clue, but in your award letter, there is a business office official who you can email, or email me and I'll just pass it along to my administrative maven who will know the answer to this, because I don't. Very often the business office is wrong at universities, but it's something we don't get involved in. So the other thing about can I answer, go back about the deadlines? If you want to be considered by more than one program, do not automatically go for the latest deadline. Use the deadline of the program who you think should be primary, right? Because there's no guarantee the other program is going to accept the co-review. If that's the case, and you just choose the latest deadline, even though that might not be the most relevant program, you're going to wind up being reviewed by the wrong program, which decreases your chance of funding.
Another question, what are the per proposal funding rates? They're asking about BCS, but I guess in general, the proposal funding rates for single PI versus collaborative proposals.
I don't know if you mean funding rates, budget, or success rates.
I suspect they mean success rates.
There really isn't much of a difference because we don't go against collaborative proposals because they tend to be more expensive, right? But we look for whether or not the collaboration is really necessary. So are these two people bringing, or three people or four people, bringing truly distinct expertise that is required to get the work done? Often, if the answer is yes, that might mean it's a really interesting proposal, right?
Another question, do STTR, so Small Business Technology Transfer grants, and SBIR grants typically have pilot data? The transfer grants, I believe they do, right? The SBIR, I'm not so sure. Those proposals are handled by a different program, right? They're handled by the STTR and SBIR programs. They don't go directly to the science programs. What does come to us, what's a little less well known, is the GOLI program. Those are proposals that link industry and academia, right? And for those get reviewed by the science programs like us. What are the success rates for masters only institutions?
Well, first of all, we're not allowed to give out actual success rates. We can only do it within a range of, I think, 10 or 20%, I think 10%. But part of that is because they're really hard to calculate. It's not that we get X number of proposals and we fund this amount. It's that we get all different kinds of proposals, like workshop proposals, which have a very high success rate because we ask you not to put it in unless we give you approval to put it in, right? So that's like 100% success rate, and that skews things. We don't get an awful lot of proposals from masters only institutions, so it's small n, so the numbers don't make a lot of sense. That being said, I know of a couple of instances, at least in the last few years, that have gone to investigators at masters only institutions. The science has to be first rate. It's the bottom line.
And it bears repeating, you know, we are not trying to only fund R1 big universities. It's very important to the NSF that funding goes to a diversity of institution types, geographic diversity across the country, diversity among the PIs themselves. So if you're feeling at all discouraged from applying, please don't. You should leave this webinar feeling very encouraged to apply regardless of what type of institution you're at.
Yes.
One just came in. What is the name of the science industry linking program?
GOLI. GOALI. Now, for people who are at master's institutions or MSI, research experience for teachers, I believe it is, or ROAs, Research Opportunity Awards, you can link up with someone in your area who has an NSF award and get some teaching relief and some research funding to work with them. The aim of which is to bring that expertise back to your university and thereby improve the research environment for the students at the master's institution or the MSI or the HBCU or the EPSCoR state or whatever.
We would actually run out of questions. I've answered the rest in text.
Okay.
Not sure if anybody is still typing or not, but that seems to be all the questions that we had.
This is Andy here. Let's just give it a few more minutes for any last minute questions to come in. But in the meantime, Betty and Mike, let me say thank you so much for the wonderful presentation for the audience today. I know, looking at some of the questions and comments that have come in, that many have found it, everybody's found it very instructive. And I want to repeat again, Mike, what you mentioned earlier, that everyone who's registered for this event will receive a follow-up message with information about how to access the copies of the slides and the video of today's recording, as well as further information about how attendees can reach out to the both of you to schedule an opportunity for a one-on-one meeting later. We'll give it just a few more minutes for questions.
I'm just going through the questions that were asked and answered, and Jen, I'm sorry, John. If one works on human-human communication, is it best to apply to PAC or linguistics? I wanted to say that we co-review a lot with particular programs. So
sorry,
perception,
Betty,
action, cognition, and linguistics, obviously all of the psycholinguistics.
The first entire half of your answer got cut off.
Okay, sorry. The question was, if one works on human-human communication, is it best to apply to PAC or linguistics? We co-review with certain programs a lot, and linguistics is one of those programs where we can co-review 10 proposals each cycle, and we often co-fund as well, because most programs recognize that, like departments, the divisions are kind of arbitrary divisions. So I would say on human-human communication, if the question has a theoretical linguistic basis, then linguistics would be the primary program. If it's more on the interpersonal communication, it might be PAC, and as Mike said, it might be social psych.
There are people that are providing their email addresses as if we are going to be sending the slides out. It should be the case, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the last thing you said was that if you are registered for this webinar, the slides, you'll automatically get an email with information about how to download the slides.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Let me respond, and meanwhile, I'll just stop this the screen sharing just for the moment, and just repeat what you just said, Mike, which is yes, indeed, everybody who's registered, the email address that you registered with, you'll receive a post-event message. At the same time, we do see 1 or 2 emails have come in. We'll make sure that those are tracked, and we'll ensure that if you've provided that email in the chat here, that you'll receive that email too. But there's no need to do that. We have your information, and we'll be sure to follow up with you directly.
One more, Betty. Do you fund work in reward or aversion processing and building an integrated function space of normative judgments?
I haven't a clue. We don't at the moment have anything really in that area. If you send a one-pager, if we're not the best program, then we can help right? We can help find a good home for it.
If the proposal is on judgments and decision making, we would also recommend looking into the DRMS program. So decision risk
On
DRMS,
management sciences.
Management sciences, too many acronyms. They are in SBE, but they are not in our division. They are in the SES division. The best way to find these things, just type the acronyms right into Google, NSF DRMS, and it'll take you right to the program. You can learn about what that program funds, learn who the program officers are, and so on.
But we do co-review and co-fund out of the division, and DRMS is one place where we have a lot of interaction. That and a program called M3X, which is Mind, Machine, and Motor Nexus in the engineering directorate. So we co-fund and co-review with engineering, with computer and information science, and with the other division in SBE very much. Looking at the questions, I want to reiterate, there's a lot of questions about how competitive someone who is either an undergraduate institution or a non-R1 institution or an EPSCoR institution. The truth is that if you look at the numbers, they might look like they're not very competitive, but the numbers are teeny. We get very few applications from these kinds of institutions. And we would very much like to increase the number of proposals that we get to much more broadly across these kinds of institutions. So don't ask the success rate and then get discouraged. Instead, look at a number that you actually don't have access to, which is the submission rate, and say there's a lot of room here for improvement.
Well, I agree. It looks like the questions have sort of come to an end. So this is maybe a good opportunity to thank you both, Mike and Betty, again, for the wonderful presentation and for the time that you spent answering the questions. Again, we'll follow up with the participants. And, you know, I started the webinar with a mention that there was clouds and rain in the DC area and perhaps reflecting our greater clarity about what's involved in the grant submission process at NSF, at least for me here, that storm has lifted. So if that's not a sign, I'm not sure what is. But thank you very much again. Thank you to NSF, and thank you for the attendees of this event for tuning in and for listening, and we appreciate it very much. All righty. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.